We're absolutely delighted to have you here today. Senator Cardin's an alumnus of the University of Maryland Law School and a strong supporter of our research and instructional agenda. He's a third-generation Marylander, and he takes good care of some of the most precious resources we have, including the Chesapeake Bay, which is just nearby. He was elected to the Senate in 2006, and he served almost 20 years in the House before that and in the Maryland legislature before that. And he served on the powerful Ways and Means Committee, so he has, as Professor Joyce said, a really broad knowledge of issues and institutions. He's well known for his expertise in foreign affairs. He's focused on the intersection of national security and human rights. And he served in leadership roles across the subcommittees of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He's been a strong proponent of the protections for small business and for the Affordable Care Act. He's been a leader in the fight to end health care disparities. He's been a big supporter of the federally qualified health centers, which is a part of my professional life in which I struggled long and hard, and which he was a fantastic supporter. And he also heads one of the issues that was nearest and dearest to my heart in that role, which is the expansion of oral health care for the poor. And we both lived through a tragic situation here in Maryland where a death of a boy for simple reason that he could not get good dental care. And so we share a bond there that is very precious. He's been a real proponent for the federal workforce and also for the right to vote. And he's been a very big champion on a lot of other issues, but I'm going to get out of the way and let him speak for himself. So I want to just tell you how happy we are to have you here. We're delighted that you all are here, and I'm going to turn it over to Senator Ben Cardin.
Thank you. Professor Duke, thank you. Professor Joyce, thank you. It's a really pleasure to be back at the School of Public Policy. As I understand it, your concentration of at least one of the courses here is in good governance, so in how do you manage government agencies. So they need you in the White House immediately. So if you could spend a little time here. This is my second visit here. I came here before the Iran vote on the nuclear agreement, and we had a pretty lively discussion. I don't know what it is about me appearing here, but today, as you know, there's now a couple other women who have come forward in the Judge Kavanaugh confirmation process. There's rumors abound about Rod Rosenstein, whether he will be still the Deputy Attorney General. So we're in crisis in Washington again. Maybe I shouldn't come here so frequently. It seems there's always a major problem. But as I told Professor Duke, I would love to stay here for a couple weeks, but I unfortunately have to return to Washington. I could talk a long time about the importance of what you're doing in School of Public Policy. You really are the administrators of our democratic system of government. We depend upon people who are interested in good policy, working not just for government, but also for the private sector, because it is a partnership on how we operate and provide public policy in our country, but it depends on the bedrocks of a democratic society. So let me just first start with some real concerns about where our nation is heading. And I caveat by saying, if I were to pick a country to live in, any country in the world that gives me the greatest hope for democracy, it's the United States of America. That's today, and it won't change tomorrow. We're going to be that leading country. So we're not going to give up, but I think we have to be realistic of where we are today. In January of this year, I authored a report on behalf of the Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that talked about Mr. Putin, his asymmetric arsenal, and his attack on democracy. It came out of what happened in 2016 on the attack on our elections, but the focus of my report was to take a look at Mr. Putin's design, which is primarily Europe, but also the United States, and the use of asymmetric weapons such as cyber, corruption, financing groups that are fringe groups, using energy as a weapon, assassination, killing people who disagree with him. And the list goes on and on and on. And it showed his effectiveness. When you think of Russia, Russia's economy is smaller than the economy of Italy. It's smaller than the economy of South Korea. And yet it dominates in world politics. It punches well above its weight. And Mr. Putin has been extremely successful in getting involved in so many countries. And his objective is for his system of government, which is autocratic, based upon corruption, winning out over democratic systems of government. And he's been very successful in the trend. Nick Burns, who is a career diplomat, has held key positions in the State Department, both Democratic and Republican administrations, testified this month in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We had a hearing on NATO. And his main message was, will democracy survive? Will democracy survive? Democratic institutions are under tremendous stress today. And we've seen that here in the United States, certainly through outside influence of what Russia was trying to do in our elections, what Russia is trying to do in the free elections in Europe, but also from within. Our system is somewhat unique because of the different branches of government, the separation, the checks and balances of our system. And we've seen a long trend, predating the Trump administration, of the executive branch trying to take over as much of the legislative branch's power as possible. That's not new. Part of it is a result of what Congress has failed to do. Congress has not enacted comprehensive immigration reform. Therefore, President Obama used the power of the presidency through executive orders to advance policies which I happen to support to protect vulnerable people that are here in the United States, the DACA registrants, the Dreamers. He used his power as president because Congress did not act. Well, President Trump is taking that to a new level. He's just using the power and using it to the extent to try to counter what Congress has done. Today in New York, the United Nations will be convening its annual General Assembly session. The Congress of the United States has appropriated funds for the U.S. contributions to the United Nations. We did that despite the sharp division and the lack of support from the president. Well, the president is threatening not to use the funds we appropriated and not make it available to the United Nations. He's already done that on certain international development assistance. He didn't make money available that Congress provided. And there's a question of whether he can legally do that or not. But it's hard to challenge the actions of the President of the United States. We do depend upon the support of the courts and the Justice Department, supposed to be independent. This president has really challenged the independence of the Department of Justice. Will the Mueller investigation be able to go forward? What will happen if Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, who's responsible for supervising Mr. Mueller and can fire Mr. Mueller, what happens if he resigns today or he's fired today? The next person in line is much closer to the president and may very well remove Mr. Mueller and compromise that investigation. Can the president do that? Can the president be held accountable for his actions during his presidency? These are all issues that are challenging our fundamental system of government, that we are challenged to see how we will deal with this. One of my greatest concerns about President Trump is the issue of corruption. The report I authored in January pointed out that corruption and the fruits of corruption are critically important for Mr. Putin to be able to carry out his attack on democratic institutions. It's the fuel. Mr. Putin, who has spent his entire life as a public servant, you'll be happy to hear about this because I'm sure you're also interested in the salaries that you're going to be able to make. Well, Mr. Putin demonstrated that you could serve your entire life in public service and become the wealthiest person in the world. Now, he did that through corruption. I don't advise that for any of you. But corruption is the fuel that can bring down democratic institutions. I was at a National Security Council meeting under President Obama where the sole subject was the growth of corruption globally and the impact it has on our democratic societies. It is a major concern. So, President Trump, I'm not accusing him of being corrupt. I am not. but his failure to live up to the emolument clause, his failure to divest of his financial holdings as President of the United States, very much compromises his credibility globally in fighting corruption problems in other countries. How can he go to countries that have serious corruption problems and say, you've got to clean up your act, when they say, well, Mr. President, what have you done in regards to Trump Towers and around the world and foreign leaders trying to economically advantage you to have favor with the United States? And you're accusing us? So it weakens America's credibility. And that's what Nick Burns was talking about at our hearing. Our hearing was on NATO and on the importance of NATO to our common defense. NATO has been there for now 70 years. It is a common defense. Any nation that's attacked that's a part of NATO, every other country will come to their defense, Article 5. It's been invoked once, only once in its history, and that was after the attack on our country on 9/11. As a result, the NATO countries have provided soldiers for us in our battle against the terrorists who attacked our country on 9/11. Over 1,000 of our NATO allies have lost their lives defending the United States in the attack on 9/11. And then President Trump goes to Europe and says that he may not be there if you're attacked. Our credibility is very badly damaged. And Nick Burns' point was that Europe depends upon the United States. There's only one USA. And if the USA is missing in action, if we're not there to defend democracy, if we're not there to defend their security, then Europe's at risk. And if Europe's at risk, the world's at risk. So these are serious issues that we are dealing with today. And I go through a whole host of different matters, different issues that affect the power of the president and whether we have the basic foundations that will allow you to do your work in public policy. I mean, today, if you're going to work for international aid organization, you depend upon our democratic institutions working here in the United States. Will they be there to defend you? So this is not a partisan issue. Although I must tell you, in my view, the Republican leadership has not presented a strong enough defense of the independence of the Congress. We have on foreign policy issues. We've stood pretty strong, but certainly not on domestic issues. Which brings me to the issue of the day, the Supreme Court of the United States. The president, and not just this president, but presidents over time have been trying to erode the power of the legislature. This president is trying to take over the courts by his nomination of Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. He's hoping he has a person there that will side with him, that a sitting president cannot be inconvenienced to appear in court or be subject to investigation during his time in office. So we're seeing an erosion of the checks and balances, and I think this president is very much trying to do that, and it could very well affect the future of our democracy. So that's my good news for today. And what I'd like to do is entertain your questions. I'll warn you, if you don't have questions ready, I'm a senator. I can talk easily for this whole hour without any problems at all. There's a lot of issues, obviously, that are pending. I'm more than happy to talk about the Kavanaugh issues and how it's likely to unfold. And we also, I would like to mention one other issue that doesn't normally come into comparison, and that is trade. This president's conducting a trade policy different than we've ever seen before. It's his prerogative. But Congress is responsible for trade, not the president. Clearly, we're the body. We delegate that to the president because we can't, 535 of us can't conduct trade policies. The president has used that delegation in a way never contemplated by Congress. He hasn't consulted with us the way he should. He didn't consult with us on the nominations on the courts. So this is different than we've seen in the past. And it doesn't always come out that way with the American people. And these are matters of grave concern. And I hope we'll get into your views on any of these subjects. But it's open season. We can talk about anything you want. There's also an election coming up. If you want to talk about politics, talk about politics. And I see a brave hand. That's good. That's a good sign.
I'm going to moderate this, if you don't mind, because we have a microphone going around. So
And I believe I'm wired, so I can walk around.
My name is Martin Sanders. The New York Times just wrote that Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein is expected to leave after the Times article about him joking, quote unquote, about invoking the 25th Amendment. Does this give you any more sense of urgency to pass legislation to protect Council Mueller?
Oh, I'm past the urgency of passing legislation to protect Mr. Mueller. We should have done it a long time ago. And now we'll be acting in crisis. The House of Representatives is going out on Friday. Their first priority is self-preservation. And their members believe they need to be home for the 6 weeks or 5 weeks before the election. How are we going to pass legislation if the House is not here? So we should have passed legislation. The Republican leadership failed in their responsibility to protect the independence of the Department of Justice in the Mueller investigation. There was bipartisan legislation that passed the Senate Judiciary Committee. It should have been passed, enacted, and sent to the President. They didn't do that. I think we're already in a crisis. I think the way the President has handled the Department of Justice and Mr. Mueller and what he says is just not what a president does. You don't demean, you don't raise to the American people the objectivity of the Department of Justice. You don't call it witch hunts and all these other things that he has. So he's already violated what a president's bounds can do. And with the firing of, or leaving of Rod Rosenstein, it makes it very vulnerable whether Mr. Mueller will be able to complete his investigation. We're in crisis. We're in a crisis.
Good morning, Senator. I asked you my question because earlier you and I showed that we share a concern about the cuts to United Nations agencies. So last week, Senator Van Hollen released a letter with 34 other senators trying to get President Trump to restore his assistance to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees and $200 million in direct assistance for Palestinian civilians in the West Bank and Gaza, money which does not go to the PA or Hamas, which is just worth just throwing out. And this aid, these cuts put at risk, according to the United Nations and Chris Van Hollen, food assistance for 1 million residents of Gaza and civilian secular education for 525,000 children, 50% of whom are girls. So I would just come here with an action ask for you to also sign your name onto this letter from Chris Van Hollen, which he put out last week, and if you would be so obliged to also speak on the Senate floor when you next get the chance on behalf of the United Nations Relief and Work Agency.
Right. No, and I support what Senator Van Hollen's attempting to do. Congress has appropriated money in regards to the Palestinians. We've done that. We've also put restrictions on how that money can be used because of making sure it doesn't go to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority uses its money contrary to U.S. foreign policy objectives. For example, they do pay rewards to terrorists, and we think that's wrong. We passed what's known as the Taylor Force Act to try to make clear we would not provide any of that type of support. We disagree with the United Nations at times, but I'm a strong supporter of the United Nations and strong supporter of the UNRWA programs, their aid programs. So I agree with everything you just said. My objection with the Van Hollen letter, it's not bipartisan. And as I said earlier, on foreign policy, we've been able to keep bipartisan support in the United States Senate. So I am working on a letter similar, a bipartisan letter, I hope, that will express the fact that when Congress acts, the President should carry out what we say, and there is already ample protection in law to make sure the monies are not diverted towards terrorism or for issues that we disagree with, so the money can actually get to the Palestinians who need it. And it usually goes through NGOs or third parties rather than through the government, and I strongly support that.
Good morning, Senator. My name is Connor Clark. I'm a grad student in SPP. I wanted to ask about your role on the Committee on Foreign Relations and how we cooperate with less than friendly and or less than democratic governments, because reality seems to dictate there must be times when you have to do that, even cooperating with Russia on the anti-nuclear bust in Moldova, counter human trafficking, counter narco trafficking, with a number of governments that still want to make good faith efforts to do that, even though they may be flawed or even failed democracies. And then what seems to be most severe in the headlines these days is Yemen. How are we supposed to figure out whether cooperation, whether that's intel, logistics, advising, how are we supposed to figure out when we're doing more to harm than help? And what do you think the public needs to know more about that isn't necessarily being discussed, knowing you have a lot of classified information you're dealing with?
Well, once again, there's only one America, there's only one U.S. We are the dominant player in the world. It's not to say that China doesn't have strength. They have a lot of strength, but they're strategic. They're not interested in globes. They're interested in their economic future more so than anything else. It's not that Russia is not a power. They are. They're spread thin, and they certainly don't have the resources or credibility anywhere close to what the United States have. So we're in a unique category. We should always use diplomacy first. Military should be a matter of last resort, and I mean last resort. We're not going to resolve almost any of these conflicts through military. They all require us to build the ability of a country to be able to govern itself and take care of its people. So our goal is not to try to militarily intercede unless we have to in regards to national security. So I'm for conversations with all the leaders of the world. I strongly disagree with Mr. Putin. I'm for talking with Mr. Putin. Kim Jong-un, to me, is horrible what he did to his own people. That's the leader of North Korea. But I'm for the president talking to the leader of North Korea. I'll get to Saudis in 1 second. But I disagree with the way that he does this. You don't set up a meeting with Kim Jong-un and talk about nuclear, getting rid of the nuclear weapons, and you don't have a game plan for moving forward. You gave Kim Jong-un a national, international legitimacy, and you didn't get much for it. The meeting in Helsinki was outrageous with Mr. Putin. No one knows what happened in that room, but I can tell you something. Russia was very happy with what happened in that room. And in the White House, they were scrambling to try to figure out how to handle it. So I'm for those types of communications. So I don't want anyone to believe, because I very much am opposed to Russia, that we shouldn't be talking to Russia. I'm not for dropping bombs. I'm for using diplomacy and using our tools, using leverage, using sanctions, using legitimacy, using trade, using all that in order to accomplish our objectives. We can do that in a much more strategic way than we are today. The Saudis and the Gulf states are strategically important to the United States. They're not our allies. They don't share our views, but they're strategically important to the United States. Saudi Arabia is a complicated country. They have a very large royal family, and that family has lots of different agendas. Do they finance terrorism? Absolutely, they finance terrorism, as does, by the way, just about every country in that region is supporting some form of terrorism. Do we condone that? No. Should we oppose it and try to stop it? Yes. So the Saudis are strategically important to us. Their number one objective is to stop Iran through its proxy in Yemen. That's their number one objective. Everything else is secondary to them. That's not our number one objective. Our number one objective is to get rid of the terrorism and end the suffering. So the United States has a strategic partnership with Yemen and with Saudis. And by the way, we support the government of Yemen, and we oppose the Houthis. So we have supported the Saudi campaign against Iran and the Houthis in Yemen. I think we've done a miserable job there. The human suffering is horrible. The United States has not leveraged the way it should be leveraging in Saudi. So I'm very much of the camp that we either do it right or we don't do it at all. And we're not doing it right now.
Hi there. My name is Alon Sherman. I'm a freshman in the SPP. What do you think are the implications of a trade policy that seems to have been borrowed from Jean-Baptiste Colbert under Louis XIV?
I know your views on that trade policy. I'm for trade. I represent Maryland, the Port of Baltimore. We need trade back and forth. Trade is good. I'm a proud member of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has a long tradition in support of trade. In recent years, it's been more mixed. But I strongly believe in international engagement. I believe it's in our economic interest to have fair trade. You need level playing fields, and you have to speak out against the trade policies that do not open up markets to the United States. And I think historically we've been willing to give away too much. I represented a shipbuilding community in Baltimore that no longer exists. We gave away shipbuilding because we allowed other countries to subsidize and we didn't subsidize. I think we gave away steel. We allowed other countries to overcapacity in steel, dump their steel here, and we let them get away with it. And we lost steel capacity in the United States, and that was wrong. That's yesterday. We got to look to tomorrow. We can't keep on analyzing what happened in the past. So we have to fight for open markets. There's one country today that still has many obstacles to trade that we have a lot of leverage with, and that's China. China does manipulate its currency. China does not protect intellectual property. China will do anything to get an economic advantage over us. And we have not stood up against China. So I am for standing up against China and letting them know they can't get away with what they did. I'm very much opposed to telling the people of Canada, our closest ally, our closest friend, that they're a national security risk and we have to impose tariffs on their steel and aluminum. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. So the way the president's gone about this and alienating our closest partners in Europe and Canada and Mexico and not getting their help and support to go after China, which we could have gotten. And now we have this frayed policy that's posing tariffs and we're in a trade war. It just shows the lack of discipline by the President of the United States. And I strongly disagree with his trade policies.
Thank you, Senator. Again, my name is Jordan Bear. I actually have a domestic policy issue. My family, like a lot of others, has been affected by the opioid crisis. And one of the main hindrances in some ways is federal prohibitions against things like safe injection sites. So I'm kind of curious about how you see that moving forward if, you know, the government's obviously struggling on it. It's a state issue as well, but if we can't also pull in private organizations and things like that as well, just because of the risk of arrest or fine. I'm just curious about what you think a good way forward is, and if you personally support safe injection sites, such as they're discussed in Philadelphia or some other large cities.
I support federalism. And that means that states should have the ability to initiate programs that they think will help in dealing with the opioid crisis or other policies, the cannabis policies of the states. They have the right to do that. The federal laws do not allow that to be done in a free manner. That's wrong. We should change the federal laws. So injection-free zones, that to me is a local decision. If it's made, we should support it, and we should not have federal laws that counter that. So I agree that the opioid issue is still growing. There's strong bipartisan support. We have a bill that we hope to pass maybe as early as this week. It's already passed the Senate. That will provide significant more revenues to deal with opioids. It gives local governments more and more discretion. In Baltimore and also on the Eastern Shore, we want to set up what's known as stabilization centers, get OD people out of the emergency room because they're disruptive in the emergency room and they don't get the care they need, to establish separate stabilization centers that can provide the care that they need. There's no funding for that today because it doesn't fit into the nice, neat mold of Medicaid or Medicare or the programs. We're trying to change that. This bill changes it so that Baltimore could qualify for funds. We're also trying to look at more creative ways. So yes, I would support the initiatives by local governments. That's their choice for that type of a zone for injections.
And we have a question back here and then right here.
Hello, Senator. My name is Jackson Drury, and I have a question about the renewable energy industry being personally affected. I used to be a solar technician, and I was just wondering what policies are being discussed in the Senate or in the House of Representatives that are going to address you know, the complete disregard that our current executive branch has for the renewable energy industry.
And as you probably know, the renewable energy field is really doing extremely well. We're seeing significant growth in both solar and wind industry in the United States. The pricing is getting much better, but they work at a disadvantage. I say that because we have permanent tax breaks for the fossil fuel industries. We don't for the renewables. So the renewables actually have a disadvantage in America. We should eliminate that disadvantage. Secondly, we need to get off of particularly oil for a couple reasons. One, we don't have enough of it in the United States. We have enough to take care of our own needs today, don't get me wrong. But secondly, it's not it's not good for our environment, it's good economically, so we want to get to more renewables, and we should be able to have more incentives to be able to accomplish that. So we're looking at neutralizing the tax code as it's biased towards fossil fuels, to stop the drillings in areas that are sensitive, including the Mid-Atlantic, and to respect the way that we deal with an energy policy globally. We have problems globally. Russia, for example, uses energy as a tool, as a weapon. So we have to have a smarter energy policy so that we can get countries such as China and Japan and Korea to use more renewable fuels and less fossil fuels.
We have a question here, and then go ahead. And then Theo has a microphone. Those who are in the back, Theo has a microphone in the back, so raise your hand and we'll hand it to you. Someone who hasn't asked a question yet, please.
Hi, Senator Cardin. My name is Leah Sivis. I'm a graduate student in the School of Public Policy. My question is about the Affordable Care Act. So with Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the individual mandate tax penalty will fall to 0 in 2019 for those failing to get health insurance. But even those that aren't insured do still need health care, and they'll probably receive it in the emergency room. And as a result of that, it'll probably drive up insurance premiums and make health care increasingly unaffordable. My question is, are there initiatives to reinstate that tax penalty?
Yes. Thanks for the question. And in public policy, healthcare is a dominant field. So let's talk for a moment about healthcare policy, the Affordable Care Act. By the way, another dominant field is housing, which is, is another area we could talk about the public policy impacts. In healthcare, the Affordable Care Act made a decision that we're going to build on our current system and make it work better than it did, which is a hybrid system. It's an American system. No other country has a system that's based upon private insurance, employers, and government insurance for Medicaid and seniors on Medicare and disabled people on Medicare. It's a hybrid system. We decided we were going to make it work. And it did. It worked well. I congratulate President Obama for getting it done. It cut our uninsured rates by 2/3. It provided quality insurance covering behavioral and addiction services, covering preventive care, covering pediatric dental. It was a strong policies. You can't discriminate on pre-existing conditions. You can buy a group policy even if you're an individual. So it really did reach out. And it worked for 99% of our country. It's a little bit higher it didn't work for because some people were excluded, like those who are undocumented were excluded. And that was wrong, but they were. But the one group that it did not work well for was those who had to come into the individual marketplace and did not have any government subsidies because their income was too high. And that market was not very stable, and it's expensive. Healthcare in Maryland cost about $8,000 per capita, your full cost. So if you're a family and you buy an individual policy, it could cost as much as $32,000, your total healthcare cost between your insurance premiums and your out-of-pocket costs. How many families can afford that? So for the individual marketplace, it didn't work very well. So we did 3 things to try to stabilize the rates. One, we set up a reinsurance program. Secondly, we provided direct subsidies to the insurers so that they could keep the rates a little bit lower for everyone. And third, we required everybody to have insurance so we didn't have the cherry picking or the adverse risk selections. They're the 3 things we did to try to stabilize this individual marketplace. Even though it's a small percentage, it's a lot of people, we want to protect everyone in the system. President Trump, to sabotage the ACA, and I really believe this. I think he went against the ACA because President Obama got it done. He tried to sabotage the ACA by eliminating those 3 things. So by executive order, under an opinion written by Judge Kavanaugh that gave him the wherewithal to say he does not have to enforce provisions he thinks are unconstitutional, President Trump eliminated the individual mandate. That means you have much higher risks. The premiums are going to go up. He also did not fund the cost sharing, and he eliminated the reinsurance programs. That's why we had 30, 35% premium increases, 50% premium increases, and horrible public relations. Again, it affected about 1% of our population, but it was something we had to deal with. So we got to build on that. We got to figure out how to correct the Affordable Care Act to deal with that individual marketplace. We didn't resolve that yet. Yes, we should reinstate the individual mandate. Maryland has already established a reinsurance program, and you saw their premiums did not go up at all this year because of the reinsurance program. I congratulate the governor and the legislature for getting that done. That was an important thing. And we also should look at how we can subsidize the plans for individuals so it's much more affordable. No one should have to pay $30,000 a year for health care, and no family should have to lay out that type of money. It's just beyond the pale of what is reasonable in America. So we really need to take on the issue itself. We now have a problem as the president is not defending the Affordable Care Act in court, and there's a case that would challenge the constitutionality, including the protection against pre-existing conditions. If that happens, it really does unravel a large part of the Affordable Care Act. Make no mistake about it, it's working. Now, this is a longer answer. If we don't fix the Affordable Care Act, there'll be a much stronger push for single payer. And you might like single payer, and we could debate the single payer system, but the single payer is the other option that's on the table. And I think most members of Congress would prefer to continue to improve the Affordable Care Act than to go to the government being the sole payer of all health care in America.
Hello, Senator Cardin. Thank you so much for coming to the School of Public Policy today. My name is Ryan Block, and I study energy policy, but my goal is to go to law school and become a lawyer. My question is, how can we counter the public's the loss of public trust in our judicial system? This would be destabilizing for our democracy.
Right. Well, you're absolutely right. One thing would help if the President of the United States would not trash the judiciary every time they rule against him. You know, the President has an audience. He said during his campaign he could fire a shot down in Times Square and kill someone, and it wouldn't affect his support. I'm afraid to tell you that may be true. He still would have that base support in this country that will always believe everything he says, even though they know he's lying. I mean that. They know he's lying. They believe what he says. So, yes, when he talks about a judge who happened to be Latino and said you can't trust that judge on an immigration issue, very racist, very biased, but it affects the judicial branch of government. And on the decisions that went against him on immigration, decisions that have gone against him, he just trashes the courts. And now he's handpicking very extreme applicants. He's putting more people in the courts than we've ever seen by any president. It happens to be happenstance. He has a very friendly Senate to get that done because the Republicans control the Senate. It is damaging, but I must tell you, I respect the judicial branch of government. They have people who are really dedicated. I know our bench in Maryland, and they're from all different philosophies, but they're good people trying to do the right thing. They understand the importance of the independence of the judicial branch of government. I think Chief Justice Roberts understands that. I think he wants his legacy to be to protect the independence of the Supreme Court of the United States. So I think there are good people there, but it would help if the legislature would protect the independence of the judicial branch of government, and the president would understand the importance of his words as it relates to our courts.
Hi, Senator Cardin. Thank you. So my question is a bit more nebulous, but it ties in. With the passage of John McCain, one of the last things that he did was block the changes to the health care law. And when he did that, he made a comment that was kind of mocked about wanting to restore the Senate to regular order. And my question for you is, do you think the Senate is out of whack historically? Do you think that there is a fix for that you can see in the future, and how do you get there?
It's a great question, and I'm going to give you somewhat of a philosophical answer. When I was in the House of Representatives, I never understood the Senate. I really didn't. I believe in democracy. I think votes matter. I think majority rules. Maybe I'm old-fashioned about that. So I never understood the filibuster in the Senate and why you can't move bills unless you get a 60% of supermajority, or why an individual senator could block a bill from being considered. To me, that's against the normal norms of a democracy. So when we saw that abused in the United States Senate, when I was in the Senate, I started to have a better appreciation that the Senate works by comedy, that the leaders can normally calm things down so that we reflect a little bit longer and we get things moving, and the number of real abuses are minimal, but they're there and we can have ways of working around them of individual senators. I started to gain a better respect for the traditions of the United States Senate. I really did. And particularly on court nominations, the tradition of the Senate, before the president would nominate anybody for the Supreme Court, he'd get you on the phone and talk to you. I talked to President Obama on both nominees, on Kagan and Sotomayor. He talked to as many Republicans as he talked to Democrats. He went over names with me. That's how we operated. There was comedy. There was a reason why that these justices received significant votes from people in the other parties over the last 20 years, 30 years. So there was that understanding. But then something happened before Donald Trump, when Barack Obama got elected president. And I really must tell you, what Mitch McConnell said during those first 2 years is what he believed in his heart. And that is, his job is to make Barack Obama a one-term president. That was his job. He had a real, I don't know how to call it, but hostility towards the Obama administration that was not logical, because President Obama did everything he could to reach out to establish relationships in Congress. He may have been a little naive at times, and maybe because of his lack of experience, he didn't fully understand all of the political problems he was going to have. But he tried. He certainly was not the partisan bomb thrower. No question about that. And you can ask the seasoned legislators who will tell you that. But something happened. And McConnell started to use the power. He was in the minority, but started to use the power as much as he could to block President Obama's agenda. He then got into a situation where he was in the minority, and he was looking at the second highest court in the country, the Court of Appeals for the district. They handle all the governmental program constitutionalities and decide more of them than the Supreme Court, because most cases don't go up to the Supreme Court. And the court had a conservative majority. But there were 3 vacancies. And President Obama could then change the direction of the Court of Appeals by his appointments. Now, admittedly, President Obama was willing to consult with the Republicans. He needed 60 votes. He understood that. He would go through the process ahead of time. But the Republicans said something that was pretty extreme. They said they weren't going to confirm any of President Obama's nominees to the Court of Appeals. They were going to keep those 3 vacancies. They claimed the workload was not enough to justify it. It's the packing in reverse. So the Democrats had a choice. We're going to let President Obama not have the power to make appointments. So Leader Reid, and I'm not going to second guess him, Leader Reid said, that's an abuse of the rules. We're going to change the rules so we can get these appointments confirmed. And he did. Now, that was the first major blow on the rules. Mitch McConnell complained about it. All the Republicans today said, the first time we get back control of the Senate, we'll change the rules back. Well, they got control of the Senate, and they didn't change the rules back. They doubled down by saying that we wouldn't even have the right of the 60-vote cooling off period for the Supreme Court, which was not in Harry Reid's. So, we're out of control in regards to the normal comedy of the Senate, but in reality, a majority is going to rule. Now, you can make a judgment. Do you like the idea of the 60-vote threshold? Remember, there'll be times when there's a progressive agenda that you're going to want to get done, and there may be a conservative agenda that you want to stop. So the one that will stop some of the conservatives may also stop our progressive agenda if we allow the 60-vote threshold always to be the rule. So when I was in the House, I would have voted like that for majority rule, because that's what I believed. In the Senate, I've been brainwashed a little bit. I do think it'd be good to get back to the tradition of the United States Senate.
Hello, Senator Cardin. I'm Marcy Kim. I'm a second-year MPP student. My question is kind of more directed towards environmental policy. You were saying how the executive branch has done a lot of action that kind of goes outside the bounds of what they're supposed to be doing, but there's also a lot of inaction within the executive branch, specifically regarding environmental rules. President Trump has kind of eliminated over 70 environmental rules during his time in this administration, and I was wondering, when the executive branch is kind of not doing the actions that they're supposed to do in enacting environmental rules such as clean air policies, where does the legislative branch come in to kind of address those shortcomings?
And thank you for that. Well, historically, we have not had a partisan division on advancing environment. Our Clean Air, Clean Water Acts, we had large bipartisan support. We even overrode a presidential veto one time. We had strong support in Congress for the advancement of the environment. And quite frankly, every administration, Democrat and Republican, up to Donald Trump, advanced environmental protections. And we had strong bipartisan support in Congress to implement that. Donald Trump will be the first president in modern times that has not promoted any improvement of environmental rules, and he's trying to go backwards. The most dramatic step he did was removing America from the climate summit, from the Paris agreements. Now, I said he did that. It's not implemented for another 2 years. So we are still part of the Paris Accords. We're just not participating in it, even though we're still in the, and that's why I went to Bonn, which was the follow-up to Paris, with several senators to make it clear that the United States is still very much engaged on the climate talks. If you look at what Congress has done, Congress has been pretty good. Not one single anti-environmental rider is in the budget. Not one. The House proposed dozens. None of them are in. The line item appropriations for EPA and for these programs are pretty good. Chesapeake Bay program, fully funded, even though the president zeroed it out. So we've been pretty good in Congress in holding our own on the environmental front. Now, President Trump, again, with the use of his executive power, has been terrible. He withdrew the clean water, and the clean water was screwed up by the Supreme Court decisions. It requires Congress to act. Congress couldn't act. President Obama came in with a regulation that clarified it, similar to what it was before the Supreme Court decision. And then, of course, President Trump is now withdrawing that. So we now have confusion on regulation of water, which is, again, he's moving in the wrong direction. He of course, withdrew the amendments in regards to the power plants, which is bad. He's done a lot of really bad, some of the chemicals things that he's doing is bad. He's doing bad things on the environment. We may have a couple votes in Congress to try to overturn that. I doubt if we can win in the House. We may be able to win in the Senate, but I doubt if we can win in the House.
Thank you for being with us. My question is about Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court and what that might mean for a woman's right to choose. I'm sure you've heard it from a lot of your constituents. We're very concerned about the future of Roe v. Wade, but the truth is a woman's right to choose has been chipped away at the state level for decades. And you believe in federalism, but my state of West Virginia only has one abortion provider now because of burdensome state laws. So my question is, do you see any federal legislative avenue to protecting a woman's right to choose?
Mm-hmm. This really is, this is not a federalism issue. This is a constitutional empowerment. If you get to a woman's right of choice, go back to women having the power to make their own decisions and government not telling them what they have to do and not do. And it'd be very interesting if it was a man in reverse, it would not have happened. So this has nothing to do with federalism. It has everything to do with your constitutional rights. And what worries me on a Justice Kavanaugh is will start, I think, with ruling on the side of business over consumers on health products. So that on contraception, those issues, he will say that employers can exercise their own conscience and not provide those benefits And again, if it wasn't gender, it wouldn't be this way. And so I am worried that a woman's health care issues are very much at risk. And that's a very close balance on the Supreme Court. So I think that is the immediate threat to women will be that. Also, I must tell you, the activism of the courts in protecting on civil rights will also be compromised by a Justice Kavanaugh. Roe v. Wade, there's an objective to overturn Roe v. Wade. Make no mistake about it. Will it happen immediately? I don't believe it will. I think it is not the immediate threat, but you'll see an erosion of the protections under Roe v. Wade. And yes, I think Roe v. Wade's at risk. And that is, as you know, constitutional rights. My main test on Judge Kavanaugh is that will he be an independent voice for your constitutional rights over the powerful? The powerful in this country being the president, being Congress, being corporate America, being employers. Will he side on you over the powerful to protect your rights? And every single one of his cases, he's on the wrong side. So it's a real concern.
Hi, my name's Evan Klondar. I'm a second-year MBA MPP student, and thanks again for coming by.
Sure.
My question is, you've talked a lot about bipartisanship and how you see it as an important end, in addition to all the policy aims, an end in itself. Do you think your colleagues across the aisle share that aim? And if not, which is my take that they don't necessarily share that aim as much, how do you work with that going forward, given that you do have to pass legislation with majorities of people, but you may not always have the same instinct for bipartisanship on both sides?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you. I think my colleagues on the other side share our thoughts. But I must tell you, when you have the gavel, sometimes you get a little sloppy in sharing in someone else's pain. So the Republicans have done things that are outrageous in this Congress. The way they handled the Kavanaugh appointment is outrageous. You can't defend that under any scenario, what they did. It's the fact that they didn't want to know everything before they vote. It's against their constitutional responsibilities. So I'm not defending what the leaders have done. But individual members, we get so much work done because we know we have to work together to get things accomplished. And we're friends. We are friends. I'm friendly with about 90% of the senators. There are a few. Some questions. But so, yes, I think they do recognize that. And they really want to get beyond that. So there's conversations taking place right now in regards to Senate rules between Democrats and Republicans, because rules changes should be done bipartisan. One party should not. So if we control the Senate, it's possible. I'm hoping that we can have an agreed rule package with Republicans. I mean, somebody's got to lead and start this discussion. And look, I'm a firm believer in the strength of both political parties. I think they can add a lot to the process. The Republican Party has a proud history. They believe in the importance of the private sector, empowering individuals to do things, less government. I respect that. The Democratic Party has a proud tradition of recognizing that government can help us empower people, that government needs to be part of the solution. So let's listen to each side and get things done. I'm not for weakening either party. I think that we have to be very careful about both parties being pulled and look more at how we can get policies that can stand the test of time, that are in the best interest of our country, that can allow you to do your jobs in public policy. It's hard for you to do your job in public policy if you're trying to establish a policy for opioids in America, to really solve that problem once and for all. You need to know what you have available to solve the problem. It can't change every year. You can't get the investments, you can't get the people. So it's in our national interest for us to have more moderate policies that can stand the test of time. And that's where I think we're trying to move.
So the senator told me earlier that he would like to stay all day, and I think you can imagine why that would be true. But he does have to get back to the Hill. So I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to thank the senator very much for being willing to take all these questions and for spending this time with us.
And I'd like to thank you all for being interested in public policy. We need you. We really do. You're in the front lines. And as I said in my first comments, this is the best place in the world to be in public policy and to have the hope that everyone in our country can benefit from the opportunities in America. You make that a reality, and you're dedicating your education here to give you better training to do that. So thank you. Appreciate it.